Cool. Let's get going. Thank you all for joining me today. My name is Harysh Menon. I'm a program manager with Power Automate. I specifically look at the ways in which Power Automate, or something known as Microsoft Flow, can be integrated into different Microsoft apps and services. So things like how does Power Automate work with Microsoft Teams or with SharePoint, or in this case, Excel. Today, I'll be going over briefly on like what the goal of Power Automate is and different ways in which it can be integrated with Excel, going from like a basic data store to like more complicated scenarios, like combining it with scripting as well as with running from within an Excel file as well. So with that in mind, the goal of our product, which is Power Automate, is to enable you and enable organizations to be more productive by automating repetitive business processes. The idea here is we want you to be able to spend time on the things that human beings as such are great at, which is being creative and using creative processes. And some of these tasks that can be like repetitive slash things that can be automated, we want you to be able to do that with Power Automate. The idea with integrating with different apps and services within Microsoft, as well as the third-party apps and services, is those apps provide the context, and Power Automate is basically the engine that provides the automation. So with that in mind, we have like connectors to like Excel, Teams, Word, and even third-party ones. You can name it like from Todoist or Twitter and so on and so forth. So you could also combine your processes, no matter what kind of app or service you use within your organization, with these tools using Power Automate. With that in mind, there's basically three ways in which you can integrate with Power Automate and Excel at a very high level. There is your basic Excel triggers and actions. So this is scenarios in which you primarily are using Excel as a data store, and you're using Power Automate as a way to sort of manipulate the data or take content from an Excel file, combine it with another app or service, or differently, like you could take something from, say, SharePoint or something like that and publish it into Excel. So these kind of basic table and row manipulations is what this set of triggers and actions lets you do. The next one is more to do with using a Power Automate directly from within Excel. The idea here is you might not want to run a flow that's related to the entire table or entire Excel file. You might want to do selectively, like for instance, if there's an escalation that you might want to do for a particular table in a row, this allows you to trigger a flow directly from within an Excel file. So I'll come to some of those scenarios a little bit later as well. You could also like easily figure out like what are the kind of templates or scenarios you could enable using this add-in right from within an Excel file, and also like trigger them to run them from within the Excel file as well. And finally, we have more advanced scenarios. This is by combining Office scripts and Power Automate. The idea here is scripts within Excel provide the ability to do like more advanced scenarios, while Power Automate lets you either trigger these remotely or collect information from these scripts remotely and combine them with other apps and services. So for instance, you could run a script within Excel that collects a set of information from a data sheet or multiple sheets and sends it or shares it with a like a Teams chat or a channel and so on and so forth. I will cover demos for each of these scenarios to sort of give you an overview of what Excel plus Power Automate is capable of. With that in mind, like these are the kind of three scenarios I have in mind, and I'll just pause here for questions in case there are any, but as I talk over like what are the actions I'll be covering. So for the basic action, I'll be covering like a get row and creating an approval from a particular Excel file. The idea here is you're storing a set of content within an Excel file, and you might want to trigger an approval with a set of people and then store approved webinars in this case into a different table and so on. The next one is more to do with adding a project to SharePoint. So the idea here is you might see a particular SharePoint, like a particular project that has a high cost, and you might want to like trigger that to store it separately or requiring more information or publishing it to SharePoint. And I'll come to that scenario as well. And finally, we have Excel scripts, which is the scenario here is there might be like a Excel file that's storing status reports, and you might want to run this on a daily basis. If someone's missing a status report, to like go query them to say, hey, can you give me a status? Any questions so far? I'll take a pause before jumping into the demos.
No questions so far. So I think you can continue.
Awesome. So for basic sort of table manipulation and within using basically the Excel connectors for reading a row and writing a row, the scenario that I sort of conjured up here is you might have a webinar such as this one that you're preparing for, where you might want to collect information on what are the kind of topics that someone might want to present. So the idea is you could potentially even automate this particular step and say, send out a form, Microsoft Forms survey, and say, hey, are there any topics that you might want to present at our wonderful webinar? And all of those are then stored into an Excel file. But the idea here is to take that one step further and trigger off an approval process based on the information that's in this table. So you can see here, I'm not going to go through the entire process of creating a flow because that would take a fair amount of time, and I want to make sure I can complete and save some time for questions as well. But the idea here is I have used a manually triggered flow, but you could potentially run this off of a scheduled flow as well. The only difference there is a manually triggered flow, you are basically specifying when you want to run the flow. Whereas a scheduled flow, you can say something like, run this every single day for the next 2 weeks, or run it every week, and so on and so forth, like some kind of a recurrence pattern. From there, we use the Excel action to get a row. So you can see here, it takes a standard set of inputs like where a particular file might be stored, which library within like a SharePoint site, which is the exact file. So in this case, it's the approval scenario get row that I've copied it to, and it asks you for which table. And then the main key column I'm looking for is send for approval, and if that's set to yes. Power Automate, basically based on actions from the previous step, will let you use tokens within actions as well. So for instance, if you go into title here, you can see that we have a bunch of information from the Excel file directly available to you. So you can do things like copy over the title column into the title section. You can come up with like a more complicated message that you might want to send to your approvers. Things like, hello, a new webinar request has come in from first name, last name. This is their title, this is the description, and this is the proposed date, and so on. So all of this is based off of columns that are there over here. So the second you specify in this previous action, like which table you're targeting, we go and fetch and say, oh, these are the columns that are available to you that you could potentially use as part of your flow. So the next step here, so what this particular flow is doing is fetching the content from this Excel file and triggering off an approval and sending that into Teams to get this particular session approved. So the idea here is I've created an approval, and this is like a first-party approval action that Power Automate supports today. And then we post a message into Teams and wait for a response for that approval. Then we also provide like condition statements so that you could create more complicated actions if you wanted to. So in this particular case, I'm looking at whether the approval was approved or rejected, and based on that, I can take different actions within my flow. So to automate like that process in that sense. So here I'm looking at if the outcome is approved, I go into the yes branch of my flow, and I can basically add a row into the approved table. So you can see here again, I'm using the add a row into table action, and I'm picking all the same information directly from this step, this step where I did a get row, and just copying over the contents into this new approved table, writing all the information down, but also adding in the approval status, the approval comments, and approval date. So you can see here, if I switch to my approved table, there's nothing in here right now because we haven't triggered this process. But once it does, you'll see information being copied over from one to the other. And finally, we have posting a message. So once the session is approved, we want to notify the people of this particular webinar that, hey, the session is approved, we're good to go. And after that, we might want to delete that row from the proposals table so that we know that this particular session is taken care of. So let's run this flow just to see it in action. So I'm just going to trigger it manually. So I'll say I'll perform the trigger in action, say test. As part of running the flow, it basically sets up all the connections that are required for a particular session. So that's what's taking a bit of extra time than I would have wanted. There we go. So when I say run flow now, it takes you to like a flow details page. which sort of shows you the execution of a flow as well. So it says that I've manually triggered it. It's done the get row action. It's going into the create an approval action. So then I'm expecting to see something in my Teams client. So if I go back in here, approval sometimes involve creating a database in the background within Power Platform as well. So that could take a little bit of extra time. So that's potentially what's happening here, or the demo god is just being mean. There we go. We created the approval. So now we posted the adaptive card into the channel, and we're waiting for information from the set of approvers on whether this particular session is approved or not. So if I go back into my Excel, so you go back into my Teams, you can see here I've got a new message as of 4:12 p.m. here in PST saying, hey, there's a session called Power Automate plus Excel requested by this so-and-so person. And you can see here all the information from the Excel file is present as part of the card itself. So you can say, hey, a new webinar request with from this person with this title, with this description is available. Do you want to approve or reject it? And you can give information as well. So you can see here all the information is copied over from this particular row within Excel. So I can go back into my Teams client. And so the people who are approving sessions can come in here and just say approve. You can give it a few comments saying, looks great. Let's do this and hit submit. And now this takes control back into the flow and does the rest of the actions that we've configured. But it also gives you within Teams itself, it says that, hey, this session has already been approved with this comment, with this particular comment, and this is the Excel, this is the actual link to the approval. So now if I go back to my run history, you can see my flow is actually completed. And if I go into my Excel file, you can see the proposals now is empty because the session has now been approved. And if I switch to my approved tab, you can see now there's a new row in here that says this particular session is approved, and all the comments that we have that came as part of the approval is present here. So things like approval status, the comments that we left as part of the Teams message, and so on. So this is a very simple scenario of collecting information in like a table, reading it into Power Automate, distributing it using Teams, and getting that data back into the Excel file to sort of complete the loop, so to speak. Now let's look at a slightly more advanced scenario, which is using like the embedded Excel, Power Automate widget within Excel. So we have an add-in for Power Automate or Microsoft Flow within Excel, which is available as part of your data tab as an add-in called Flow. When you open this, it basically lists all the flows that are associated with a particular file. In this case, I've created one already called request audit, but I'll show you how we go about doing that. So you can see here, it basically lists all the flows that are associated with the file as well as templates that you might want to get started with. So I can say I want to add a new one, and I can say create from template. And it lists all the potential templates that might be applicable to you. So things like for a selected row, complete an action, create an item from SharePoint, request approval for a selected row. So you could have done the last scenario using this particular thing as well. So it's up to you how you might want to model your flow, so to speak. So for instance, in this case, if I say, let's do the SharePoint one, you can see here, it gives you information on what this particular flow is doing. It connects to the necessary connectors, like in this case, SharePoint and Excel, and you can hit continue. And it shows you the entire Power Automate session within Excel itself. So you can see things like where the location is, what the table is from the drop down, and what you wanted to do. So in this case, I might want to create an item in a particular case. So the idea here is you might have a process in your organization that says that there's an Excel file that maintains all the projects and the costs associated with these projects. And if there's something that requires like an audit or something like that, you might want to trigger off something from your Excel file, but like escalate it to like say SharePoint or push it to Teams or send an email to a particular person. You can create those kind of instant automations from within this element. So I'm not going to go through creating a new one. Let's just see the existing one in action. So request audit is the one. So just to show you the entire flow. So it just says for a selected row, do something. The other point I want to sort of call out is as part of you triggering a manual flow, you have the option to like add inputs to it as well. So for in this case, I have added like a note section saying, like, do you want to add any other inputs as part of requesting this audit? So you could just add another option that says, for instance, let's take another text field that says threshold or something like that, and say like, and enter a value that says what was the threshold cost or something, and save this. So now if I go back to my file, you can see here for this particular Excel file, I have this request audit flow available. So I have chosen this row, which is at a cost of 50,000. I might want to like trigger off an audit. So I'll say run. And you can see the flow actually runs within the context of the Excel file itself. And we define two inputs that we want to collect as part of running this flow. So one thing is the notes field as well as the threshold. So I have things like expensive project, might need audit, what was the threshold cost, and let's say 30,000 was the threshold cost, and I can run the flow. So now the flow has additional values or additional inputs that it has to run with as well. So it has the information from the columns here, but also it has information on like what you entered. So now I am writing this information into SharePoint. So if I switch to SharePoint and go to my budget audit screen and hit refresh, you can see here it's got the project information from the Excel file. I'm getting the cost information, the owner email, the notes as well that I've added as part of the input. So for instance, I typed in expensive project might need an audit. So all of that is coming through from the Excel file directly into SharePoint. You could use this for like other complicated scenarios as well. You could think of things like adding something to your Agile board from an Excel file, requesting costs for a particular like work item or something like that. You could potentially create tasks from within an Excel file, like say in Planner, or if you want to use a third-party app, like things like Trello as well, as if you want to do this. So this is a scenario where you're basically triggering a flow right from within an Excel file for a particular row, and you're getting all the information off the row as well as inputs that you might have configured. The last scenario is slightly more
Sorry,
complicated.
Harysh, if I can interrupt quickly.
Yeah.
We've got a couple of questions that I think might be worthwhile answering before you move on to the next section. So the first question is, do we need to have a good knowledge of SharePoint to really understand and be able to set up these flows? And the second question is, we see you're working in Excel Online at the moment. Is it possible to use Excel Desktop to do the same thing, where you're sort of launching flows off from the Excel file?
Great. So I'll tackle the second one first. Yes, you can run the flow add-in from within Excel Desktop as well. I'm running all of these demos from a demo tenant that I've set up, which is why I'm using Excel on the browser and not on my desktop. So yes, you can run it from desktop. For the first question, how much information do you need about SharePoint? It's actually very minimal. If you already have a site set up, we do all the heavy lifting for you. So for instance, let me show you through the process of creating that. So if I choose SharePoint, sorry, I could type. You can see here there's a bunch of actions that SharePoint supports that you could just use straight up. So for instance, in this particular case, let's replicate this create item action. So I can say create item. And you can see the action pops up over here, and it immediately asks you for like basic information. So things like, where is your SharePoint site? What is the list you want to target? So even there, like we give you a little drop down which tells you like, hey, these are the SharePoint sites that you have access to. Just pick the one that you're interested in. So these are all the groups I'm part of. So for instance, in this case, I'm interested in the sales and marketing site, so I'm going to choose that. And based on this information, we populate the list column as well. So again, you don't have to like remember the list ID or like the URL and so on. You can just hit the drop down, and you can see here I have two lists that I have with this particular site. And the second you choose a particular list, we actually dynamically fetch all the columns from a particular SharePoint list, and we display that right up in here. So you don't have to think of like, hey, what API to use, what columns are present, etc. We show you that information. We even like highlight things that are necessary, like things that are needed for creating an item. So those are the ones that are required parameters using that little red star. And we also have like, these are the other columns if you want to enter. So if you want to, for instance, enter a title in here, you can say, I will pick the title from for a selected row step. And these are all the things that are available to me. And I can just say, I will choose project name for title. And for price, I might want to look at the cost field. So I'm just going to say cost, and owner email, again, picking everything from that Excel file. you have access to the entire files, columns, etc. So I can just say email formatted, and notes is picking again from that input. So I'm just going to choose, it should be notes somewhere. There we go. No. So this is, that's how easy it is to like create an item. Similarly for like updating an item and so on and so forth. It can be as simple as you want, but more importantly, it can also be as complicated as you want. So if you wanted to do things like add in conditions in here, add in switch cases in here, like create loops in here, like we have the flexibility for you to do that if you so choose. Any other questions before I move the Office scripts on?
No, that was all the questions. So please feel free to continue the demos. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, so the final sort of demo I have is one for collecting status reports. So the idea here is you might have a project that's spanning multiple teams, and you have to collect information from these users on what the status of a particular project is on a weekly basis or something like that. So you have this Excel file where you maintain all the statuses, and you want to make sure there's nothing empty in a particular status field. So the thing that it combines here is the power of Office scripts to sort of like calculate information and pass it to Power Automate, and the ability for Power Automate like trigger these scripts remotely. So I have enabled Office scripts within my tenant. So if you have done so, if you need to do so within your tenant, you can do so from the admin portal. But once you do, you will see an Automate tab in your Excel file, and you will see the option to either record actions or code editor. Today, Power Automate only supports the code editor, like running a script remotely. We don't support the record actions, but we are working on supporting that soon. But when you click on code editor, you can see here that I actually have two scripts that I have as part of this particular Excel file. These are like essentially like a simple JavaScript that gets information on who hasn't completed a report, and the other one is called save response, which collects information from Power Automate and writes it back into the Excel file. So let me show you how I can remotely connect to it using Power Automate. So if I go in here, I have this option to manually trigger a flow. Again, you could instead use like a recurrence option where you run this every week because you want to collect information from users every week. And then if you're going to run script, again, it asks you for very basic information. So things like where is a particular file stored, which library, what's the file. And the second you specify the file, we also fetch what scripts are available for it. So here it knows that it has the get people and save response scripts that are active. And I'll come into the details of the script a little bit later once I run this particular flow. So you can see here the get people script is configured as output people, like it outputs email. And so I have basically created a loop in here to ask every single person who's not having a status within that Excel file and posting to teams and asking them for a status. So in this case, I'm picking the email information from this script and posting an adaptive card, which I've configured over here, and asking them for the status. And once they do give me the status, I run another script, which in this case takes inputs. So in this case, this script is called save response. And the sender here, it again takes the email information and the response that the user might have entered and writes it back into the Excel file. So let's just run this just to show it to you end to end before diving into the scripts a little bit. So if I say test, format, just a note, like I use a complicated action like post an adaptive card and wait. You could potentially use something simpler, like just sending an email. You could potentially just send the person a message and say, hey, you've not entered the status, enter a status. There's a bunch of options that, oops, something went wrong. Of course, demo gods have to interfere. Let me make sure. All right, let's try this one more time. Oops, sorry, failed again. So I'm going to show you an earlier version I ran. Sorry. So this was from an earlier try that I did. So for some reason the script is failing. I need to go debug that. So the idea here is it ran this particular script and got these set of outputs from the Excel file, and it's basically writing back like from this particular output, it's triggering a loop, and it's posting to this particular person, which is the admin, asking for a particular status. And once the user responds to the status, so you can see here like the data that it got back from Teams, it's writing that information back into the Excel file. So if I switch to my Teams instance and go to chat, like this was like an earlier version of it that I ran where it said like, thank you for providing your status. This is how I entered the status back into here. So I'm sorry I couldn't, the flow is not running for some reason. Let me see if there's some issues within the script quickly. I'll just show you what the script does as well on a high level. So over here, all it looks at is it takes the content from this particular table and looks for things. It looks for cases where the status is empty. You can see here, and it's also configured with returning people like a name and a string, like this person's name as well as this email, back into Flow. So that's how Power Automate figures out that these are the two inputs that it's getting out of this particular script action. So similarly, if I go back, looks like this particular no index is the issue. I need to go debug that later. And if I go back to my saved responses, you can see it's something similar, but in this case, there's no response type, but there are like information that it's taking in as inputs to this particular function. So things like the context of the Excel file, the sender information, like who the email was, so that we can match it to like which, to which email we want to like associate this status with, as well as what the actual status is. So that's the response string, and going from that. For some reason, row index seems to be the issue. Not sure why. But yeah, so that's running Excel scripts with, Office scripts with Power Automate. We have the ability to summarize, we have the ability to query an Excel file, figure out what are all the scripts within it. If there are inputs or outputs associated with the scripts, the Power Automate action is actually smart enough to figure out like what it needs as an input or what it provides as an output, and show that as dynamic tokens within the Power Automate editor as well. Any questions on this? I'm sorry, the demo didn't work. But hey, it wouldn't be a live demo without one failure.
Completely understand. Live demos are always fraught with danger. There are no questions, no further questions at the moment, but of course, if you're opening up to some questions now, then we will probably see questions coming through in 15, 20 seconds or so.
Yeah, great. While that comes in, I just want to give you like the kind of information we're looking for. So from you, like as you interact with the field, what are the type of scenarios you're looking to enable with Excel and Power Automate? If there's some ideas here, I'd love to like either let you know if it's possible or not, or like take this as feedback to say, hey, these are the kind of actions you might want to introduce. And also like the other thing that I haven't spoken about is we recently introduced something called UI flows. So what UI flows lets you do is automate actions within an within a desktop. So things like your mouse movements and like inputs, etc. So the idea there is Power Automate allows you to integrate with apps and services that have like an API layer that you can remotely access. But there might be legacy applications which don't have this kind of an API layer that have to be run manually. So the idea with UI flows is you can actually remotely connect into like a virtual machine or to the actual desktop and use these applications by replicating the steps of like a mouse and email, so you can record these steps, etc., and run it. So that's a more value-added service, but you could potentially look at combining Excel and UI flows in maybe a future session or something like that. But there's a bunch of things that are possible there as well. In terms of just resources for you to get started, there is our Power Automate documentation site, which has a bunch of learning modules. And the other big part is our Power Automate community. So if you're running into like roadblocks with errors with particular actions or triggers or possibilities, like if you want to figure out like how do I extract this particular string from the output of an action, like there are community members or MVP members in our community that are helping people out. So that's a great place to like figure out some of these answers. So just want to give you those resources.
So we do have a question from Mukesh, which is, can you show a demo of how you created the script? I'm not sure how much else you've got in this presentation, but if you've got time, maybe that's something that people might be interested in.
I don't have that. I mean, I basically just copied over the Excel file, but let me see if I can just walk you through that file. So in order to actually create this, all you need to go is go into Automate, choose Code Editor, and it lists all the files that are available to you. By default, like if you choose say a new script, we already like repopulate like the workbook, the information, etc. And from here, this would go into like more of an L300 session. I think someone from Office Scripts would run that a lot better than I would. And I think there was an Office Scripts session as part of this as well. So it's using the same infra. So I would suggest using that session than me going over this half-heartedly.
Yeah, that's right.
Half the information, that's it.
So just a reminder to people that because the sessions are recorded, you do have the ability to go back and check out the Office Scripts session if you want more details on those. So definitely check that out once we release the recordings.
Yeah, so the idea for me is more about being able to remotely being able to run these scripts, not so much the authoring of the scripts.
Cool, that's all good. So Ingeborg has a question. My Power Automate editor is never as quick to show things as yours. Sometimes it takes several seconds to open up an action like create item. What slows the Power Automate editor down? And so my thought was always that Microsoft are always running on the super streamlined version that is always faster than anything that we run. But can you clue us in as to what might slow it down possibly?
It should be fast, let me put it that way, but of course, reality is different. The only thing I can think of is where your environment is hosted. So all Power Automate sessions are run from like environment. So if you're physically present in a different location from where your environment is, it might take time for like for instance, if you're based in Australia or Southeast Asia and you have the server that's based in like the West Coast of the United States, then maybe like your environment itself might be a little bit slower. So that's one potential reason. But just checking to make sure the environment that you're configured is the same or in the same region that you're mostly operating from, that would be the primary thing I look at. But otherwise, it should be snappy. There are some cases where some of the actions require dynamic fetching. So that might be the other reason. So for instance, there are two different types of actions, right? So there's ones where your inputs are pre-populated. So something like, let me take an example, something like post a message to Teams. Like we know exactly what are part of this action. There's like the team name, there's the channel name, and the message. But in some cases, there are dynamic actions. So things like create an item from SharePoint requires an additional step to like go fetch the columns from SharePoint and show that within the action. So that's another place where like the thing might take a little longer. So that's the best I can have.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. I know I've used forms in the past, and if I've got a lot of questions in the forms, that'll take a long time to load up all the items. So Ingeborg has a follow-up comment saying she finds it gets really slow if a SharePoint item has a lot of columns, which is exactly what you were suggesting just then. And if a flow has many actions, it gets worse, she says.
Okay, that's fair feedback. I'll take it back to my dev team just to like give this information. And yeah, if the SharePoint item has a lot of columns, so definitely like the fetch itself will take a little bit of time just to show you the whole UI. Good feedback though, thank you.
So we've cleared out the questions. Again, I'd like to remind folks that you can ask questions if you like. We're trying to answer them as we see them. So if you do have any questions before the end of the stream, then we'll try and answer them as quickly as possible. Harysh, do you have more presentation to go through, or is this now basically a Q&A from your perspective?
Yeah, it's just Q&A for me. So for me, I'm primarily done. So if there's anything, I'm happy to answer about Power Automate in general, even beyond Excel with Power Automate. If you have questions, I'm happy to take them.
Okay, sounds good. Well, while we're waiting for people to pop up more questions, I'm just going to share my desktop quickly. To remind people that yes, there's an evaluations QR code and survey that you can take. This is hooked up to a Microsoft form, which may or may not be connected to Power Automate on the other end. And we would love to hear your feedback about the session and what you thought. So please do scan the QR code, hit the bit.ly link, and let us know what you're thinking. And of course, the other slide that everyone knows and loves, the Microsoft Excel team seeking research participants. They love hearing from their customers, and your involvement can help shape the future of Excel. If you're willing to be contacted to provide feedback and participate in future research studies, then please sign up. With that, we'll leave it for any other questions that people have. Give people some time to respond. I'd hate to think this last session is going to finish before we hit that final 55-hour mark. I wouldn't want to close the stream early.
Yeah, sorry, I ran through mine a little bit fast, I guess.
That's all right. You're just very efficient. Okay. Actually, so here's a question that I'll ask you while we're waiting for other people. What are some of the, I guess, the most interesting or sort of off the off non-standard things that you've seen people do with Power Automate in the past?
Actually, there's a really good story of that, which is very recent. So we had a Power Automate Business Applications Conference like a little while ago called MBAS, and people connected it from all over the place. And one of the scenarios that someone brought up was because of this whole COVID crisis that we're part of, the Justice Department of New York, their marriage department specifically had said, like, we need to find a way to get people married, because people still want to get married, but we can't do so in person. So we want to do so remotely. So they used Microsoft Forms, SharePoint, and Power Automate to sort of help their counselors, I guess, to get collect all the documents, get all the information, put it in one place, schedule like a Teams meeting, and used like a combination of SharePoint, Teams, and Power Automate to like get people married in this time, which was cool.
Yeah, wow, that's really awesome. It's definitely outside the realms of your standard business, usage of the tools. I love hearing stories like that.
Yeah, for sure. So the idea with like the tools that we build with the Power Platform in general is to like enable anybody to like, if you dream up of a process, we want you to be able to like essentially codify it without like having to have a CS background or something like that. So these were people in like a legal department that came up with that process and just wrote it down, like configured it within Power Automate quickly and easily. So we want these tools to be that simple. So that's the goal that we're moving towards. Mm-hmm. Everybody's a maker, I guess.
That's the way. A couple of comments that Ingeborg's made has actually prompted a question that I think quite a few people have asked over the years. Mm-hmm. What prompted the change from Flow to Power Automate? And do you think that's actually sort of helped the product or hindered it?
I will admit I'm a fan of the old name, but the idea was Microsoft Flow is part of this suite of products called Power Platform. So which is why we wanted to make sure that the idea was, if you wanted to become a maker or use these low-code, no-code tools to configure an application, there's a suite of these tools available to you. So that's Power Apps, which was always Power Apps. There was Power BI, which was to like manage your data, and then there was Microsoft Flow, which is the only odd one out. So we wanted to sort of combine those and say, hey, these are the suite of products that are available to you, and so which is why we renamed it to Power Automate. It is confusing to people, and I really like the old name, but that's what it is.
I do like the tribute to the old name and the fact that the website link still says Flow. And that confuses me to no end, because I'm pretty sure I tried typing powerautomate.microsoft.com and got nowhere. So yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of those old I guess markers that are still there. If you look at the add-in for Excel as well, it still says Flow.
I did notice that, yes. But I think this is part of the confusing thing with the terminology, that the tool itself is called Power Automate, but the individual flows themselves are still called flows.
Yeah, so we did ponder whether we should change that as well, but like the idea is like the tool is slightly different from the entities it creates. So it's sort of like saying Microsoft Word is the application and documents are what it creates. So that's how it mind maps, I guess. But yeah, that's what it is right now.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right. Well, I don't think we're going to get any more questions. It's currently 20 minutes to the end of the hour. We're getting people saying thank you for the session, so I might take that opportunity to thank you as well for running this session. I'm sure people have appreciated it, and yeah, we look forward to seeing what new things become available in Power Automate in the future.
Yeah, I'm glad to be part of it. This is really cool. Yeah, and I look forward to see the kind of automations you come up with. Next time, maybe I'll be telling a story that one of you had about using Power Automate in Excel in a cool way.
Excellent, that's the way.